Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, What's Going On in Your Body? A Way to Explain Emotions and Behavior During a Year of Increased Stress. Your presenter today is Elizabeth Goldsmith. She is a first-year student in the School Psychology Doctorate program here at the University of Utah. She recently moved back to Salt Lake City after living in Portland, Oregon. Very cool. For the past few years, and she is now working with the behavior response support team at the U-TTEC lab. Before I turn it over to Elizabeth, just a couple of reminders that the talk will be until 2:45. At the end, for 15 minutes, we will have a question and answer session. So if you have a question you would like answered, please feel free to drop that in the chat during the presentation. Friendly reminder to please remember to mute your sound. And if you're comfortable, please feel free to turn on your video. I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth.
Okay. First off, I just want to thank everybody so much for coming today. I know that especially Fridays can be really busy for a lot of us with a lot of time on Zoom. So I really appreciate everyone taking time out of their day. So this presentation, again, is called What's Going On in Your Body? A Way to Explain Emotions in a Year of Increased Stress. And my goal is for everyone to leave this presentation feeling as though they have kind of a better idea of what stress looks like and some ways that they can mitigate those physical symptoms that come along with stress. So before we get started, I want to give you a little bit of a layout about what the flow of what we'll be talking about will look like so that you can better predict those transition periods. So first, I'll introduce what we're talking about and lay a foundation there. Second, I will talk about the research that's been found on this topic regarding children and adolescents. Next, I'll talk about what's actually occurring in your body. And last, we'll address what we can do about that. So just so we're all on the same page moving forward, what does somatic mean and what would somatic symptoms or complaints be? Somatic means related to the body. Somatic symptoms can present in various ways depending on the emotion and depending on the person. These symptoms could be shortness of breath, a rapid heartbeat, nausea, tight chest, a headache, or just general abdominal pain. So when we're talking about somatic symptoms, these are some examples of what those symptoms can be looking like. On one hand, experiencing somatic symptoms of emotions is an adaptive trait because they can act as a very reliable way for us to gauge our emotions. For example, when somebody has a quote unquote nervous stomach, we're quite literally saying that their uneasy or nauseous stomach is indicating that they feel nervous. On the other hand, somatic symptoms can be maladaptive when they start to take over our emotions and begin to have detrimental effects on our health, well-being, and overall functioning. It's important to note before we move forward that when I'm talking about somatic symptoms in this presentation, I'm strictly talking about somatic symptoms that are related to psychological and emotional well-being, not related to physical pain or physical injury at all. So oftentimes when kids learn about emotions, it's centered around how you feel when something good or bad happens. And emotions are typically centered around conversations of how, when, and why an apology is needed, and forgiving a friend, what forgiving a friend looks like. When a child is asked what they feel like in the moment, they might even be asked to reference a Likert scale, like on the screen here. These methods are great because they apply practical skills and visual cues for interpreting emotions. However, they lack the importance of the physical symptoms that kids typically experience. So along with thinking about what learning about emotions typically look like for kids, let's also consider what emotions typically feel like for kids. Put yourself in the mind of your third grade self for a minute and try to imagine the first thing you felt when you would get in trouble. For a lot of kids, it's typically the feeling of your stomach dropping, which is really uncomfortable if you've experienced it. And they feel that before they even start to contemplate what's about to come next. On a more positive note, imagine you are 7 years old and tomorrow is your 8th birthday party. What do you feel? Sure, you most likely feel the emotion of being excited, but that's probably coupled with that overwhelming feeling of butterflies being in your stomach. So today we're going to be talking about that less often talked about side of emotions, that somatic side. To add a little bit more of a clinical context of somatic symptoms before we get started and how children experience emotion, we can look really quickly at diagnostic presentation for some disorders. For kids, both childhood depression and panic disorder are two diagnoses where children have a tendency to report more of those somatic symptoms of those disorders, such as fatigue or nausea for depression and rapid heart rate and quick breathing for panic disorder. This is so prevalent that there's actually a term for it. When a child experiences more of those somatic symptoms and the cognitive symptoms of a disorder, it's called masked symptoms. And it's thought that this might occur because of a lack of ability to verbalize cognitive emotion at a young age. But as we'll learn later, it might also be a result of a still developing prefrontal cortex. So when I started looking into how children often experience more somatic symptoms of emotions like stress and anxiety than adults, I thought, well, couldn't that be a good thing? I thought if kids have a hard time cognitively recognizing their emotions, isn't it all the more beneficial that they have those physical cues to also work with? After looking into the research, I realized that, sure, as I mentioned before, somatic symptoms give us a great gauge on our emotions and how we're feeling. But for some kids, somatic symptoms can have a huge negative impact on their academic functioning. Studies have found that children with higher levels of somatic symptoms due to anxiety or have poorer attendance and are more likely to engage in school refusal behavior. Similarly, children with more frequent somatic symptoms on average have lower academic performance than their respective peers. So this finding is really important because it brings to light that this is a huge issue, not only because of the discomfort and emotional toll of somatic symptoms, but also because it can lead to a lower academic trajectory if symptoms aren't recognized and supported from a young age. When looking at the relationship between children's emotions and how they're exhibited through physical feelings, research has found evidence that individuals, both adults and children, who are less aware of their emotions may appraise certain bodily signals like a rapid heartbeat or sweating incorrectly as signs of physiological problems, as opposed to attributing them accurately as an emotional response. This might seem pretty surprising to some of us. I know it was very surprising to me when I read this in the literature. I thought, how could you not know that your heart is racing because you were asked to stay late after class, as opposed to having a heart defect or something like a heart murmur? It wasn't until I thought back to some of my early experiences as a kid that I really started to understand this concept. For example, once when I was a kid, I was in my parents' room before bed. I don't even really understand or remember what happened next, except for I remember I was crying while I was walking down the hallway to my bedroom. And I remember my dad saying, "Elizabeth, I think you're just tired." And in response, I very firmly said, "I'm not tired, I'm sad." And almost immediately after this happened, I remember thinking, dang, I'm pretty tired. This type of emotional understanding is exactly what this concept is addressing. Like many third graders, I had no idea at the time that when we feel really tired as a kid, you're far more likely to feel sad or upset because your executive functioning is likely decreased at the end of a long day. But from that moment forward, I was able to better recognize when I was irritated or sad because I was tired, as opposed to something in the environment like my brother bothering me that was actually causing me to be sad. In this study, researchers gave the multidimensional anxiety scale and had kids answer questions from it like, I have pains in my chest, or my heart races or skips a beat, or I feel sick to my stomach. These questions acted as a measure of those somatic symptoms for those kids. The research then had parents of those kids fill out the emotional regulation checklist for children, which generally measures how well a kid seems to understand their emotions or be able to regulate those emotions. At the end of the study, researchers were able to accurately predict children's severity of somatic symptoms based on their emotional awareness. In other words, kids with lower emotional awareness were far more likely to experience somatic symptoms, and researchers were able to predict that. Along with somatic symptoms increasing for children with less emotional awareness, it has also been found that children who encounter adverse experiences at home report more somatic experiences than those with healthier home environments. So, from what we know so far, if a child has low emotional awareness and encounters adverse experiences at home, they are very likely to have exaggerated somatic symptoms than their respective peers. However, if a child encounters adverse experiences at home but has emotional awareness, that emotional awareness might be able to act as a little bit of a buffer for those somatic symptoms. Another really interesting study, and I promise we'll be done with studies in a minute. Another interesting study looks at somatic symptoms and how they're related to peer victimization. So bullying or kids being mean to each other in school, and found that adolescents experience higher rates of somatic symptoms in response to technology-oriented peer victimization, like getting a negative comment left about you on Facebook or Instagram, than any other form of peer victimization. The adolescents in the study reported often feeling rushes of panic or feeling sick to their stomach when this type of event occurs. So, after learning about all of these factors that influence somatic symptomology for kids, let's look at what's actually going on in the bodies of these kids and adults. So, within our bodies, everybody has a central nervous system that's broken into two parts. This might be review for some of you, but it's really important to go over. So there's the two parts, which are the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic. Oh, let me take a glass of water really quick. And the parasympathetic nervous system. For our sympathetic nervous system, it's our response that is in charge of that fight or flight response. So when we're in the presence of a threat, let's go primal for a minute and say you're being followed by a lion, or not so primal and you're being followed by the mountain lion in Provo. As you see the lion, your sympathetic nervous system engages and is responsible for using your saved up energy and conserving your body's resources. On a more apparent level, your sympathetic nervous system will increase your heart rate, dilate your pupils, and increase your heart rate or your breathing, essentially preparing you to fight off that lion, otherwise again known as your flight or flight response. After you successfully avoid the lion, your parasympathetic nervous system is engaged to calm you down by doing things like decreasing your heart rate, stimulating digestion, and slowing your breathing. To look a little bit more in depth, your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, that HPA axis, is the process that happens when your sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight response, is engaged. So when you experience a stressor, your hypothalamus sends a hormone called corticotropin to your pituitary gland, which sits right at the base of your brain. Your pituitary gland then sends adrenocorticotropin hormone to your adrenal gland. Adrenal glands are generally responsible for producing adrenaline and cortisol. Cortisol is responsible for essentially rationing your body's energy and creating a feedback loop to your brain and pituitary gland. The feedback loop tells your body when a threat is gone or when it's still present. In today's world, we have more prolonged stress than we're meant to occur, like preparing for a presentation or preparing for a test, or right now, thinking about COVID-19. Our HPA axis are more constantly activated than they ever have been before. When we experience stress, our HPA axis engages our sympathetic nervous system, and there's 3 stages involved in this process. So the first stage is alarm, where an alarm goes off in your body and when you are in the presence of some sort of immediate threat. You then respond in one of 2 ways. On one hand, you can have an adaptive response where you recognize the stressor and do something to resolve the situation, such as paying the bill that's been sitting on your counter for weeks before it's due tomorrow. Or you could recognize that maybe that situation is something that can't really be changed or reduced, but you can engage in strategies to reduce your body's sympathetic nervous system and return to a calm state. And we're going to talk about what some of those tricks and tasks are later. So once you pay that bill or intentionally engage in activities to activate your parasympathetic nervous system, that system that calms you down, you emotionally and physically feel relief, which is the third stage due to successful allostasis. On the other side, you may engage in a resistance response, which is more common. This response can be a tendency to avoid or put off stressors by saying, I'll pay that bill later. However, this response more often comes from inability to control that stressor. For example, if you're a student in high school and you have a test in 2 weeks, you might be studying and doing your due diligence to get an A, but that lingering stress won't be resolved for that 2-week period until that test is over. Right now, this resistance response could also be due to something like COVID-19, where an activity that used to feel mundane and boring, such as running errands or going to work, may create a stress response that we cannot relieve because it can't really be controlled. Sure, we can wear masks, we can socially distance, we can stay at home, but then we might still be fearful for others or fear the inevitability that we're going to have to go to the grocery store and be around people at some point. When we cannot seek relief from these stress responses, we enter the exhaustion phase of chronic stress. This is the point where the hormones that your body is using and that you secrete during that stress response are depleted, which can result in somatic symptoms of headaches, nausea, increased heart rate, or feeling sick, or any of those general somatic symptoms. So this whole sympathetic nervous system is a really great feature at face value, but now that society has adapted very far from where we began, its specific features are a little bit less applicable. One of the primary purposes of our sympathetic nervous system is quite literally to prepare us to run. Again, when we think back to our more primal existence, we used to see a threat and run from it. Even if that threat was something like a lack of food, we had to physically get up and go hunting or gathering as opposed to walking 2 feet to a fridge or a cupboard. These activities perfectly complemented the sympathetic nervous system because we were essentially doing exactly what our physiological arousal was telling us to do and allowed us to burn off the energy our bodies were pulling from reserve. As soon as the threat was gone, which back then used to be a few minutes, an hour, maybe a day, or a few days, our body would return to homeostasis. So we used to almost solely take that adaptive route with stress. Now, when a stressor comes our way, our bodies begin conserving energy, our blood pressure increases, our respiratory rate increases, and we remain sitting at our desks, which is not the process our bodies are made to do when we encounter a threat. And that's why we get stuck in that exhaustion phase. So if you're more of a visual person, we can look at it this way. Let's say this little red star on the screen is a stressful event. For a kid or a teenager example, let's say there was a negative photo or an embarrassing photo of you posted on Instagram, and you see that someone who isn't very kind to you at school was the one who posted it. In an ideal response or in a situation less artificial than Instagram, you might experience an increased heart rate and take a few deep breaths before returning to a calm state. If negative comments keep on popping up, you can continue to take deep breaths and move along with your day. This would be our adaptive response. On the other hand, you might be struck with panic when you see the post and experience an increased heart rate and shortness of breath. You put your phone down, you toss it on your bed, you feel better, but you remain at a pretty high level of arousal. Next, you hear your phone buzz and someone has written another negative comment on that photo of you, and your body once again responds as though it's under a threat. From here, there's typically 2 routes after this has been going on for a long time. The first is your body drops into a state of little to no arousal, and your sympathetic nervous system is stuck off. Where you may begin to experience depression, flat affect, exhaustion, chronic fatigue, or a lack of appetite. The second possibility is your sympathetic nervous system, which again is in charge of arousal, gets stuck on. leaving you in a state of panic, anxiety, hyperactivity, restlessness, chronic pain, or sleeplessness. One of the most common ways this can be happening with the stuck on state right now is with COVID-19 looming, where once again, activities that used to feel mundane are constantly activating our sympathetic nervous system. So after learning all of this information, I wondered why some people get so nervous and anxious about something that others aren't worried about at all. I frankly find it kind of frustrating in some situations. So it was really a curious thought to me. So it turns out there are two different routines in your routes in your brain, and one is quick to panic and one is slow to panic. So when we're presented with a stressor, let's say you're a teenager again, who just saw a negative post about yourself online, one option is you immediately catastrophize and assume everyone hates you and going to school tomorrow is going to be a disaster. In this case, your brain takes a fast track to panic from your thalamus, which is essentially the post office of your brain. And then that message gets sent directly to your amygdala, which is the emotion center of your brain, causing you to panic. Another option is you see that negative post and that information goes from that male center, your thalamus, and before going to your amygdala, the message takes a pit stop at your prefrontal cortex, which is the area of your brain in charge of a lot of things, including reasoning. So while the message is in your prefrontal cortex, you might think, that wasn't a very kind message that person wrote about me. Maybe that person was feeling sad and wanted to take it out on somebody. Or you could think something along the lines of, that was a bummer that person doesn't like me, but I have plenty of friends and family who know all the great things about me and are in my corner. With this route, by the time the message gets to your amygdala, you might be thinking this comment was a bummer to see, but it's not such a big deal. In the first option, you may be like that green line that we were just looking at on that graph, where your body immediately jumps and engages that sympathetic nervous system, and you feel those somatic symptoms. For the other route, your heart rate might increase slightly, but for a moment, and then you'll quickly calm back down. The tricky thing is the prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until you're about 25 years old. So for kids, this process of thinking through threatening experiences is a lot harder than it is for adults. So after spending all of this time talking about stress, where you're probably more stressed than you were at the beginning of this presentation, you should be thinking to yourself, so what are we supposed to do about all of this stress and these somatic symptoms? Next, we're going to go through a couple of options to reduce your somatic response to stress. I'll touch briefly on 5 different things. So the first one is increase exposure. 2 is increase somatic emotional intelligence. 3 is practice physical ways to calm your sympathetic nervous system. 4 is increase social competency. And 5 is reframe. Okay, so I won't spend too much time talking about this one because it's a concept that most people are pretty familiar with, but it is still important to talk about because it's really important, particularly for training our brains to use that slow to panic route and making that pit stop at our prefrontal cortex. So most people have a fearful reaction to something, whether it's a situation, an event, an object, or a person, whatever it is, it most likely increases your somatic symptoms through that physiological arousal. For me, it's snakes, which is why there's a snake on the screen. When we know this association between that object and our increased somatic symptoms, we tend to avoid it. Let's say, for example, my snake fear. I am an avid backpacker, but try to avoid backpacking in the evening with tall grass in deserty areas. However, I have a friend who isn't afraid of snakes at all and even picks them up on hikes sometimes. And after being around them for a while, I started to recognize that snakes aren't always going to hurt me, or I'm not going to end up in a hospital from a rattlesnake on every hike. So after this increased exposure, whenever I would see a snake, I was able to interpret that information and it could go to my prefrontal cortex. And there I was able to reason and think back to my past experiences where seeing a snake wasn't harmful and nothing bad ever happened. And it caused me to have less somatic symptoms when a snake was present. So there's hundreds of tools, moving to the next thing, for teaching children about emotional intelligence. But I really like this one because it specifically targets practicing how to recognize physical symptoms that are correlated with specific emotions for kids who are experiencing high levels of somatic symptoms. In this game, the teacher or guardian or whoever it is list some different symptoms that they're feeling in their body, and then the kid tries to guess what type of emotion could be resulting from those feelings in their body. So for example, I could say, I have butterflies in my stomach, my heart is beating really quickly, I feel like I need to run around, and I can't sit still. The kid could then respond and say, well, maybe you're feeling anxious or excited, or you're feeling really nervous. So this is one really great opportunity to teach kids a little bit more about those somatic symptoms, because they're not really talked about very often when we are learning about what emotions are. Typically, when we talk about some sort of physical response to emotion, we're talking about what it feels like when you get hurt physically versus emotionally. And those categories are really separated instead of considered as one and the same. So, although there's a lot of ways to reduce somatic symptoms, like through mindfulness practices or cognitive behavioral therapy, this one is one that I really like because it uses very physical tricks to reduce a very physical problem. So, TIP is a tool from dialectical behavioral therapy, which Lauren and Hunter touched on 2 weeks ago. The T in TIP stands for temperature. Temperature encourages a person experiencing somatic symptoms to change the temperature of their body, preferably to cold, which can be done. You can run water over your forearms that's cold, or you can hold ice cubes in your hand. It sounds very unintuitive when you're feeling stressed or anxious to hold ice cubes, but it can be very helpful because when our bodies quickly become cold, our heart rate slows down and we engage our parasympathetic nervous system, therefore calming us down and reducing those uncomfortable and undesirable somatic symptoms. The I in TIPS is for intense, meaning intense bursts of exercise. If you think back to that graph that we were looking at a while ago, this is primarily for those who are stuck in that lack of sympathetic nervous system response in that stuck off stage at the bottom. Engaging in bursts of exercise can help increase your heart rate and reactivate your sympathetic nervous system because you are increasing your heart rate and getting your body to do those things that it's currently not doing. P is for placed breathing. By breathing slowly and in a controlled way, we can activate our parasympathetic nervous system to calm you down once again. And the last one is P for progressive muscle relaxation, where you stimulate various muscles in your body and you squeeze them really tight and then you let them relax. And you can do that from your head to your toes or from your toes to your head, and either way is a really great way to engage your parasympathetic nervous system. So for kids and adults, I just wanted to show this visual really quickly. I'm sure everyone's been told at some point in their lives to take deep breaths, which sometimes can be easier said than done, even though it's a simple task. So this visual for breathing, and there's millions of variations of it, are available all over the internet. And I think they're a really helpful tool, especially for kids to follow along with, is something that can set an intentional and beneficial pattern to their breathing to engage that parasympathetic nervous system. I don't know if anyone has ever told a kid to take deep breaths, but oftentimes what they think are deep breaths aren't slow and controlled. So they're not really doing what we need them to do, which is engage that parasympathetic nervous system. And I could also personally look at these all day. I think they're great. So next, children with social competency are less likely to experience somatic symptoms, and it is believed that this is due to the increased social support that comes available with increased social and emotional awareness, which emphasizes that need to help develop social skills in our classrooms. Last, and perhaps the most surprising, a study at Harvard found that individuals who believe stress and those somatic symptoms are a good thing that help your body perform better than those who believe stress is always bad. They studied this by having two groups, Group A and Group B. Both groups were placed in a stressful situation of having to perform a task with people watching them. The people who were watching were instructed ahead of time, of course, to give looks of disapproval throughout the stressful task. Individuals in Group A were put in the stressful situation without any positive priming, but individuals in Group B, on the other hand, were told that stress is your body's way of being courageous and preparing you for any task ahead. At the end, individuals in Group B performed significantly better on this task than those in Group A. So, as surprising as it seems, reframing somatic symptoms and stress in general to being a positive as opposed to a negative can have positive outcomes on a kid or adult's experiences and ability to succeed academically or in work. So, as this cycle of perpetual stress continues, somatic symptoms of increased blood pressure, nausea, headaches, and shortness of breath become a constant as opposed to an occasional or temporary issue like they're meant to be. In sum, the stress response can become more damaging than the stressor itself. Let that sit in for a second because it's unbelievably true. Think about some of the things that we regularly find ourselves stressing out about. Sure, they're very important, whether it's work or getting things done on time, but nobody is going to get hurt and it's not threatening your life. But it increases our somatic symptoms as though we're having as though our life is being threatened. The odds are you're probably not being threatened at all. It is stressful, but it's not life-threatening. In today's world of dramatically increased stress, we need to collectively keep our stress response in perspective. And I hope this presentation gives you a little bit of insight about what's going on in your body and a couple of different tools to help mitigate those problems. So the last thing is I want to leave everybody with some continuing education if it's something that you're interested in. I put on 3 different options just depending on what you prefer for education. So one is pretty short. It's an article that's by the New York Times and it's called The Science Behind Your Child's Tantrum by Ashley Abramson. And this article talks a lot specifically about those 2 pathways to panic in your brain, that one that's really quick to panic and that one that's shorter to panic. And it puts it in the perspective of a tantrum for a child. The second one is the book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers by Robert Sapolsky. And this book, if you have more time and are really interested in this subject, is really great. And it really targets that idea that our stress response is really made for our more primal period in our existence as opposed to right now, and how that chronic stress really can impact the overall health on your body. The last one is a video called How to Make Stress Your Friend by Kelly McGonigal. And it's a TED Talk. I know not everybody loves TED Talks. Some people don't like them at all. Some people love them a lot. But I think that this one is really great and it gives a really great outlook onto what stress can do for you as opposed to looking at it only in a negative light. So it might be something that's nice to look at after this presentation. All right, and that is all I've got, unless you want to look at my citations.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was a great presentation. We're going to end this webinar with a Q&A session. So if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat box, or if you're brave, feel free to jump in.
Elizabeth, I have a question for you. So some somatic symptoms are probably a lot easier to recognize than others. Like, a headache or stomach ache, it's pretty easily recognizable, whereas other somatic symptoms like tension in the shoulders are, easier to ignore. What recommendations would you have for individuals who maybe aren't good at recognizing or paying attention to the somatic symptoms, the messages that their body is trying to tell them?
Yeah, I think that that's one of those really important things about the fact that we don't talk about it at all in schools or when we talk about emotions. Yeah, like the tightened shoulders are a huge thing. And I think that if in starting with elementary education, if we talk more about recognizing our body's response and making that more of a routine thing when you're checking in with your emotions, if you say, oh, I am feeling a little funny, let me like go through from head to toe and assess my body and see where I'm at and what I'm feeling, and starting to learn how to recognize those emotions more, or like specifically doing it at different periods in the day, like after class, recognizing if your body is tense or when you go to bed and what those look like.
Awesome. Thank you.
Elizabeth, this was a great presentation. I feel like I learned a lot. When we think about these topics you're talking about, something that came to mind was like we're changing our relationship with the fact that we have these responses and like what we do about those things, and like really normalizing that early on. So I really appreciated the previous question about just like how we're tying that into the work we're doing with students. That we kind of need to start these conversations as early on. And like you said, there's like different ways we can do it. And I really appreciate some of those practical activities that you shared to really make it salient for folks who are trying to do this stuff as well.
So I had a question about that one study where one group was primed to think that stress was like good for you and helped you in situations. Because you mentioned that they performed better on the task. Do we know anything else about maybe like the mechanism behind that better performance, whether like thinking stress was better helped them stress less, and also I wanted to add, what would be the implications for chronic stress with that thinking it's better for you?
Yeah, so with that study, so first of all, the task was they had to go onto this stage and talk about the things about themselves that they thought weren't as positive about themselves. So basically like a really tough interview. And that's when those people were looking at them with looks of disapproval. And I know the group B that was given that positive prime, they were told, which actually makes a lot of sense, those somatic symptoms like an increased heart rate, butterflies in your stomach are also things that you feel when you're really excited. And so they said these feelings in your body are your body trying to show you that you're courageous, and it's just preparing you to be able to fight and run and do all these things. And like it can make you be able to do challenges that you weren't able to do. So it just reframed those body feelings specifically. I don't know if they really talked about it necessarily in terms of stress, but just recognizing those body symptoms as ways to be courageous instead of worried or scared. And then your other question was, what was your other question?
Just the implications of that reframing in the context of chronic stress.
Yeah, so I think that it's one of those things that has to, so, chronic stress is a lot of times due to a big event that's already happened that's really stressful, or thinking about events that are going to happen that are far away that we're stressed up until that event for. And I think that these symptoms and these strategies really work for that second type that I just mentioned, where there's a stressful event coming up and you can mitigate that stress ahead of time. For chronic stress, if there's like an event that happened, like if a family member is sick, I don't know if these techniques or strategies would work quite as well, because it's more of a, after lag as opposed to combating something in the future.
just want to say that was like a great explanation. I had like a really similar question to Jeremy because that study really stood out to me because I get anxious and sometimes I just reframe it as like I'm really prepared and really excited. But I was kind of wondering the same thing, like if that's great for chronic stress and like if in the long term we should teach like suppression of these symptoms or like ways to reduce the symptoms, or if we should be like reframing them. And it seems like kind of both depending on the situation.
Yeah, I think that it does depend on the situation. I would really encourage everyone to go watch the TED Talk. I again know that some people don't love them, but it really talks about that Harvard study and reframing a lot. And they actually found this crazy study about how people who thought that they were more likely to die because of stress actually were the ones to die due to stress. They did this huge longitudinal study where they surveyed people and then used public records to see which of those people died, and which seems very drastic, but they did find that people who have more of a positive outlook on stress and those somatic symptoms have better life outcomes, which is kind of shocking.
I mean, at the same time, it kind of makes sense because if you tell people like, by the way, experiencing stress is destroying your body, that's just going to make you feel more stressful, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And in that study, they also found it when you think positively about stress, you know, when you're stressed, your cardiovascular systems, your arteries start to close up, you know, which is really bad. It creates higher blood pressure. The people who were experiencing those same somatic symptoms, but were looking at it in a positive light, their arteries stayed expanded. So it like truly changed their physiology.
And so important to consider now while we all are experiencing such elevated levels of stress. Elizabeth, what's like one like practical skill that you find? Like I know you went through a lot, but like what's your go-to that you find to help reduce stress?
So I worked at an inpatient unit for a little while with adolescents, and from that and from my personal life, I think it sounds crazy, but holding ice really makes a huge difference from that tip strategy. If you ever try it, it is like magical in my opinion. All the kids at the inpatient unit really always loved it. We put cool washcloths on their forearms or give them ice to hold. And because it is engaging that physiological response of, there's this whole concept when you dive into cold water, your blood pressure really slows down to keep you calm and to keep you warm. And so when you're holding ice in your hands, it starts engaging that in your body. And so whether you cognitively are recognizing it yet, it's calming down those sympathetic nervous systems. So I really like that option. And then what other ones do I really like? I think that GIF of the breathing slowly, I think that those visuals along with it, they're everywhere online. And I think those are really helpful because I think that it's harder than we think to, you know, actively take slow and meaningful deep breaths.
I appreciate that. And I think that awareness piece is so important because that really changes how you even have the relationship with those experiences. So the more aware we can be of our physiology, we can do a lot.
Yeah, right. I used to get pretty annoyed when people would tell me to take deep breaths, like why we're wasting time. But then when you understand that it's actually changing your body and your reaction to the situation, it is a lot more beneficial and definitely not a waste of time.
I think that's particularly relevant for many of the students that we serve in some of our day treatment programs. That's what we see too, right? Is that there's a lot of resistance to engaging in the deep breathing, but when you actually can engage in it kind of appropriately, it's a totally different experience.
Yeah, I'm not somebody who knows very much about mindfulness or, you know, meditative experiences, but I'm sure that people who are really engaged in that side of emotional intelligence would know a lot about how that really does decrease somatic symptoms by increasing your parasympathetic nervous system.
I think we'll actually get some of that topics in a few weeks. We have a presentation for our webinar series that focuses on that.
Maybe this will be helpful for people's presentations in the future for some calming ahead of time.
I gotta say, for me, a lot of this was so I'm learning about a lot of this in Dr. Pompa's neurobases class, and so this was awesome to hear it just from like a slightly different perspective, but also talk like y'all are right on point with a lot of the same content. So it was a nice like quick review after these classes where we're just cramming in a lot of this like neurology content, which for me can be kind of hard to grasp from time to time. But I really appreciate how clear your webinar was very easy to understand, and it like made some things turn on in terms of what I was confused about in class. And so it like connected things for me. So I appreciate how applicable it was. Thank you.
Yeah, and I wish I even had time to go into how different aspects of this can impact in different ways. So maybe of you, I was originally going to more talk, like really focus on those two pathways of panic. And one of the ways that I actually first looked into that was about exposure to different cultures and diverse populations. And when you increase your exposure to different populations or different types of people, you're more likely to use that slow route of panic as opposed to that immediate threat, scared side of panic, which is, you know, just another way that brain pathway can be hugely beneficial.
I just have a lot of questions, so I'm sorry if I'm taking up other people's time. But speaking of that slow and fast pathway, I really liked the information about like when the thalamus communicates directly with the amygdala as opposed to going through the prefrontal cortex, and I think it has particular implications for our friends with like you know, like ADHD, autism, where they have a lot of this executive dysfunction. So can you speak a little bit more to that on how like strategies maybe for kids who don't have as much of that executive function ability?
Yeah, so I mean, like I said, your prefrontal cortex, regardless of whether you're neurotypical or have more of an underlying problem with, you know, attention or anything like that, your prefrontal cortex isn't developed till you're 25, so it's already hard already. But one of the main ways that can really help with that is with cognitive behavioral therapy. There's, you know, a lot of homework with cognitive behavioral therapy, and a lot of it is worksheets that say, this situation is happening now. What am I thinking? What could I think differently? What can I do next? And I think that having that visual of like maybe after a situation that was harder for a kid with ADHD or with ASD, looking at one of those worksheets and really going step by step and saying, okay, this is what I was thinking. What if we slowed down and thought about it a different way? And then what if my behaviors changed because of that? You know, I think having more of that visual, like written element to practice slowing down would be really beneficial.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Any other questions? You guys have had great questions.
All right, I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you everybody for attending. This concludes our webinar for today. If you know somebody who couldn't attend this webinar but wants to watch it, this presentation is recorded and will be published on the U-TTEC lab website, which could be accessed by visiting u-tteclab.com. And yeah, thank you again so much for coming, and thank you, Elizabeth, for presenting.